Okay, I think the time has come. Let's get this show started. So welcome everybody to the first session of ITCS 2021. This is the session on privacy and cryptography. As James said, so there's 5 talks in this session. Each one will have 8 minutes speaking, and of course there'll be a little bit of time switching in between. And also, as he said, things are a little bit experimental. So let's see how it goes. My plan is to set it up so that possibly one quick question can go after each talk. But the majority of the questions, save them until the end, and we'll have an open time and you can address for each of the different authors. Okay, so the first talk in the session is on distributed differential privacy and counting distinct elements. This is a work, also I should say, I saw all the names in this session are going to be quite the exciting challenge, so I apologize in advance. So this is by Lijie Chen, Badih Ghazi, Ravi Kumar, and Pasin Manurangsi, and Lijie will give the talk.
So hi everyone, I'm Lijie Chen from MIT. Thanks for joining me here today, and I'm super happy to present my joint work with Badih, Ravi, and Pasin from Google Research. So since the talk is on differential privacy, let us start by recalling the definition of differential privacy. Suppose we have an algorithm M runs on a data set D consisting of n elements x1 to xn, and produces a probabilistic output n of D. And we say 2 data sets are neighboring if they differ by at most 1 element. And we say an algorithm M is epsilon delta differentially private if for all pairs of neighboring data sets D1 and D2 and all possible events E, the probability of E happening under D1 and D2 differ by a multiplicative factor of E to the epsilon with a small additive tolerance delta. This definition is beautiful, but it does not entirely address the concern of privacy in the distributed setting. In such a setting, each user holds their own data xi initially. To naively implement the above algorithm M, they have to send their raw data xi to a single curator, and then the curator runs the private algorithm M on the collected dataset D. The important issue here is that after sending your raw data to the curator, you have to trust their integrity for the rest of your life. And sometimes this may not be a good idea because the database could be hacked and your information could be lost. So the local model in the differential privacy is proposed to address the concern of that users may not want to trust the curator. Instead of sending their raw data to the curator, they first apply a randomizer R on their data xi, and then send the output of the randomizer to the curator. And we use the transcript to denote everything the curator sees with dataset D. Here, in the local math model, the transcript is just a concatenation of all the messages Rx1 to Rxn. And the curator just runs the algorithm on the transcript. The privacy requirement now is that even the curator cannot learn anything about a single user. So in the same spirit, we can define the epsilon delta differential privacy in the local model as follows. So definition is basically the same. This looks good, but it also comes at a price. As we'll see later, to achieve the same privacy, algorithms in local models sometimes perform much worse than their counterparts in the central model. So motivated by the drawback of the local model and the central model, the shuttle model aims to provide better utility while putting as little trust as possible on the curator. This model is an additional layer of a shuffler, which applies a random permutation on all the messages sent by the user, and the curator runs on the shuffled version of all the messages without knowing which user sent which messages. So in other words, it anonymizes all the messages. Again, we define the transcript with dataset D as everything the curator sees in a protocol. Here, the transcript is the output of the shuffler, which is a random permutation of all the messages RXIs. And the curator runs on the transcript. Similarly, we can define the epsilon delta differential privacy in the shuffle model as well. We note that Similar to the local model, here we put no trust in the curator, but we do put additional trust in the shuffler by assuming it correctly performs the random permutation. Therefore, the privacy can go through. So to compare these models, a great example is the basic aggregation problem, where each user gets a single Boolean bit, and the goal is to estimate the sum with constant epsilon while polynomial differential privacy constraint. As one can see, we have a spectrum of trust in the curator and also a spectrum of the utility. Here is the arrow. And the great thing about shuffle model is that for this basic problem, it can achieve constant error by only putting additional trust in the shuffler. Therefore, it cannot achieve the best of the both worlds for this problem. And in this talk, we'll study the problem called count distinct problem, which is another basic problem in the distributed setting. So there are n users, each holds their own data xi, and the goal is to estimate the number of distinct elements among x1 to xn under the constraint of being epsilon delta dp. In the central model, the problem is very easy, and you can achieve constant error. And we first show that not only for constant epsilon, in fact, for some d equals n by polylog n, for lim d epsilon, the problem is still nearly maximally hard, as it required n by polylog n error in the local model. And surprisingly, we further show that if we further increase epsilon from lim d to lim n, then the problem suddenly becomes very easy. It can be solved with error root n comparing to nearly n. Note that lim d equals lim n minus or log n. So it is very close to lim n. And for the shuffle model, we first show that for constant epsilon and the inverse quasi-polynomial delta, count distinct is nearly maximally hard for the single message shuffle model, in which everyone can send at most one messages. And next, surprisingly, we show that if we allow each user to send at most half plus little 01 messages in expectation, instead of being worst case, then the problem can be solved by shuffle protocol with square root n error. Therefore, there is a big gap between messages in worst case and the messages in expectation. And note that the count distinct problem has global sensitivity 1. So our result implies a 1 versus near linear separation between global sensitivity and error in local and shuffle model. This answers an open question. We also obtain a 1 versus near linear separation between global sensitivity and error in two-party differential privacy, and answer another open question. And check the paper for more details on this part. And finally, we obtain some new lower bounds for other problems in the shuffle model. The selection problem is defined as follows. So there are n users. The S1 gets a d-dimensional preference vector, and for index j, the score of j is defined as the expectation of xij. And the goal is to find out j star such that the score of j star is close to maximum. And we show that for constant epsilon, 1 over n delta differential private shuffle protocol with at most k messages from each user cannot solve selection if n is at most d by k. Our result is similar to a recent independent work by Chen and Allman. They study a more restricted version of shuffle model called robust shuffle model, and they prove that for unbounded messages, such models still cannot solve selection if n is at most root d. So let's then conclude with some open problems. So the first question is, can we prove lower bounds for unbounded messages in the shuffle model without the robustness constraint? As you can see, their lower bounds require the robustness condition, while all lower bounds do not work for unbounded messages case. And also, can we extend the single message shuffle lower bound for count distinct to the region that delta equals 1 over polynomial? All lower bounds requires delta equals 1 over quasi-polynomial. So that's an open question. Thank you. That's all.
Okay, thank you very much. So actually perfect timing on the talk. Excellent. So let's take a quick question while the next speaker is setting up. So Salil.
Hi, Lee. Can you say anything about the techniques in the lower bounds, and in particular, do you identify a hard distribution of inputs for these problems, for the count distinct problem?
Yes. So actually, the lower bounds we use the lower bound techniques for proving lower bound of the estimate the unseen problem in the literature of property testing. So here we use something called moment matching. So we construct two random variables with matched moments, but one variable is mostly 0 and one variable is mostly non-zero. And then we use these two random variables to construct two very different distributions. They behave similarly. Their moments behave similarly, but somehow the number of distinct elements differ dramatically. And then we show that local algorithm cannot distinguish this based on some personalization trick. I mean, it's a high level idea. The lower bound itself is pretty complicated. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
All right, perfect. So Mikito, go ahead and claim the stage here.
Oh, sorry, could you stop sharing? Sorry, I can. Okay.
Sorry.
So, may I start now?
Okay, excellent. So just a second. So the second talk will be on basing auxiliary input cryptography on NP-hardness via non-adaptive black box reductions. This is work by Mikito Nanashima, and indeed he will be giving the talk.
Yeah, thank you. So, okay, my name is Mikito Nanashima. So, yeah, today I'm going to talk about this topic. Okay, let's begin with the introduction. So this work is related to these two fields, worst-case hardness in complexity theory and cryptography. And as you know, there's a huge gap between these two fields. And one of the most challenging questions is to construct one-way functions based on the hardness of NP problems, in other words, to show this direction. So, and very natural approach, a very basic approach to show this direction is to construct a reduction from solving some language L to inverting some function f, and if this L is NP-hard problem, then we can show the control position of the above result. But to construct such a reduction, there's a specific barrier on the types of reduction. That is non-adaptive black box reduction. So, and so in this setting, this type of reduction looks like this figure. And the key part is this reduction accesses adversary for inverting f as a black box, as an oracle, and it makes its queries parallel or in one round. And this is a very simple and familiar form of reductions. But unfortunately, the previous work showed that if we can get such a simple reduction for this problem, then we can show this result. And the point is that so if L is NP-hard problem, then this implies a collapse of polynomial hierarchy. In other words, under the very reasonable assumption on polynomial hierarchy, we can exclude such an attempt. And this previous work gives us very important directions, developing non-black box techniques or adaptive techniques. But in general, to construct such a somewhat complicated techniques seems to be very challenging task, especially for this program. So that's why in this work, we try to suggest the third choice, that is to change the goal. Or in other words, we try to get intermediate cryptographic primitive instead of standard cryptography. And our focus of this work is auxiliary input cryptographic primitives, which was originally introduced by Ostrovsky and Wigderson. And this type of primitive is not one specific function, but defined as a family of functions indexed by binary strings, and which has a weaker security condition that for each polynomial adversary, so depending on this A adversary, there exists a secure path for adversary. And this is very natural intermediate model between usual worst case hardness and average case cryptography, and breaking such a auxiliary input cryptographic primitives can be formulated as a kind of worst case of average case problem. That's why, yeah, we cannot apply directly the previous work on non-adaptive black box worst case to average case reduction to this case. That's why the important question is, if we try to get such a intermediate cryptographic primitives, then are non-adaptive black box reductions sufficient? And we address this issue in this work as a first step for such a study on intermediate primitives. Okay, now let's see our result. Again, our goal is to consider the following question. If we have some non-adaptive black box security reduction from here to AI primitive, breaking AI primitives, then what happens? And in this work, we consider 3 fundamental types of AI primitives: pseudo-random generator, one-way function, and heating set generator. And roughly speaking, the relation among them is like this. And so the first result is the following. So if we can get a non-adaptive black box security reduction from here to breaking auxiliary input pseudo-random generator, then we can also show the collapse of polynomial hierarchy. So that's why we can exclude this part. And we also consider these 2 cases of auxiliary input one-way function and auxiliary input heating set generator. And the reason why we consider these 2 cases separately is, as far as I know, the currently known security reduction from the second primitive to first primitive uses some adaptive techniques. So we cannot translate this type of black box reduction into the first one. So we consider these two cases separately. And the second and third result is the following. So if we can get non-adaptive black box reduction, then in fact, we could not show the strong consequences like the collapse of polynomial hierarchy, but we can still surprising consequences. So we can extend this non-adaptive black box reduction to one-way function which has infinitely often security, be adaptive black box reduction. In other words, we can get NP-based one-way function. And in fact, this is not strong to exclude such a non-adaptive black box reduction, and it has 2 opposite interpretations. So negatively speaking, this can be regarded as a hardness result for getting such a non-adaptive black box reductions. But positively speaking, this can be also regarded as a new approach for NP-based one-way function, because to construct one-way function, all we have to do is to construct AI primitives via very simple security reduction. And that's why, so I guess the important question, feature direction, is to verify the validity of this positive perspective. And I will share with you more 2 directions. So first one is consider other cases where such intermediate primitives or intermediate primitives can be helpful for constructing NP-based one-way function. And second direction is, of course, there is still possibility that this non-adaptive black box reduction implies a collapse of polynomial hierarchy. That's why the second direction is to exclude such a non-adaptive black box reduction, especially for the case of auxiliary input one-way function. Okay, finally, let's see proof ideas very roughly. And this is a very rough map for the proof. And for the first result, the key part is to show this part, non-adaptive black box reduction from here to some average case problem. Then we can get non-adaptive black box worst case to average case reduction. Then by applying the previous work, we can show the collapse of polynomial hierarchy. And in fact, this reduction is also very simple reduction. And the proof for the second result here is, I guess, the key part of this work. So roughly speaking, first we translate auxiliary input one-way function into auxiliary input pseudo-random generator by using the standard cryptographic technique. Then we apply this non-adaptive black box reduction in assumption again here. Then we can construct adaptive black box reduction from NP-hardness language to breaking IO one-way function. So this is very rough explanation. And for the third result, we applied the universal expression technique to translate this type of non-adaptive black box reduction into non-adaptive black box reduction from NP-hardness language to breaking auxiliary input one-way function. Then we can apply the second result again, and we have adaptive black box reduction from NP-hardness language to breaking one-way function. That's why we can get the third result. Okay, that's all. Thank you for your attention.
Actually, just a quick question while the next speaker is setting up. So maybe you can close the share. So the next, no problem. What is it? Can you describe a little bit? What is the dist NP?
This means a distributional NP problem. So yeah, it is an NP problem, but the instance is generated according to some fixed Poisson probable distribution.
Got it. Thanks.
If you have time for one more query.
Sorry,
go for it.
Yeah, I would like to ask, what were the pseudo random number generating algorithms that you use, and why were it not feasible in your setup?
So sorry, could you say it again? So I could not understand.
Yeah, with respect to the pseudo number generations, why were it not feasible? Why was it not feasible? Because you said no, in your graph that you drew, you had if you go back to the slides.
I think the question is about that it's adaptive, that the constructions of P or G from one-way functions are adaptive, so your impossibility result didn't extend. I think that's the question.
Yes, yes.
Sorry, could you say it again? Sorry. Sorry.
I think he's asking, you had an impossibility result about P or G. And you said it doesn't extend. You had three boxes, and he's asking why didn't it extend? Because it's adaptive.
Yes. So
were there any bounds?
You mean so? Yeah. So you mean so for the second result for auxiliary to one function, it can be translated black box reduction from breaking pseudo-random generator, but then why it implies the collapse of polynomiality? That is your question?
Yes, and why did it
that's
collapse?
Why, that's why. So because as far as I know, all of known security reduction from breaking auxiliary input one-way function to breaking auxiliary input pseudo-random generator uses adaptive technique. We do not know no adaptive ones. That's why if we translate no adaptive black box reduction from language L to breaking AI one-way function into breaking pseudo-random generator, then we lose the no adaptiveness. That's why we cannot apply.
Okay, yeah. Okay, thanks.
So if we can get a very simple security reduction from auxiliary input one function to auxiliary input pseudo-random generator, then we can also exclude attempt for auxiliary input one function and auxiliary input hitting generator.
So it's not easily extendable. Yeah. Okay. Got that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Actually, in the meantime, we're having some technical difficulties here, and let's see if we can get this fixed.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Maybe I will try sharing again. There was some issue.
Yeah, go ahead and try.
It says my screen sharing is paused, but can you see my screen?
It just says that you have started sharing your screen.
Oh, okay. I'm clicking on resume share and nothing is happening.
Are you sharing your desktop or just the application?
Just the application.
Would you mind sharing your desktop and then opening the application within that?
Okay, sure. Yeah. So, and I don't, okay, entire screen, right? Yeah. Is that, okay, great. Now it's fine, right?
Yes, we just need to
excellent.
the presentation mode and then.
Okay, great.
Great.
maybe I'll start.
Good success. Okay, so the next talk will be on query complexity lower bounds for local list decoding and hardcore predicates. This is a work by Noga, Ron-Zewi, Ronen, Shaltiel, and Nithin, Varma. And Nithin will be giving the talk.
Hi, I'm Nithin Varma. I'm a postdoc at the University of Haifa, and I'll be talking about query complexity lower bounds for local list decoding and hardcore predicates. I'll first briefly define list decoding, local list decoding, and briefly tell you about our results and applications of our results to black box proofs for hardcore predicates. I will conclude with some open problems. A binary code is half minus epsilon L list decodable if for every word W, there are at most L messages whose encodings are close to W, in the sense that the distance between the encodings of these messages and W is at most half minus epsilon times N. Or in other words, for every word, there are only very few code words in the code that are close to it. Now, list decoding has a lot of applications in theory CS, and this has also been generalized to sublinear time algorithms as local list decoding. And the goal here is to recover each coordinate of a desired message from the list locally in sublinear time. And a more formal definition is like this. For every word and every message M, such that the encoding of this message is close to the word. So you want to basically, when you're given query access to the word, there exists some advice that your algorithm gets such that for every message coordinate, you output the bit cut of the desired message at that coordinate with probability at least 2/3. And we study local list decoding of very low rate codes. A candidate example is the Hadamard code. And Hadamard code has very efficient local list decoders. A seminal result by Goldreich and Levin gives local list decoders with list size and query complexity 1/epsilon² for the Hadamard code. And the question that we ask is whether the query complexity can be improved, say 1/epsilon to the little of 1, if we allow for very large lists. Now, the motivation comes from the fact that improving this upper bound has the potential to obtain better hardcore predicates based out of one-way functions. Now, here are our results. For large epsilon, we show that the query complexity of local list decoding is 1/epsilon² omega. And this is a tight lower bound as evidenced by the upper bound by Goldreich-Levin. And our lower bound holds for large list sizes, and in particular also for codes of very low rate. Okay, so for codes for very low rate, this is also the first lower bound even for small list sizes. And our result extends and improves the result of Greenberg et al. That worked for codes with larger rate. In particular, the result of Greenberg et al. Did not apply for Hadamard. And for smaller epsilon, we show a lower bound of omega root of 1/epsilon. And together, these rule out the upper bound of 1/epsilon to the little of 1, and even for very large lists. And here are some consequences of our results. So Goldreich-Levin theorem can be restated in terms of obtaining hardcore predicates. Suppose you have a very hard one-way function that for circuits of size S, it is hard to invert the function f with probability more than rho. Now, based on this f, you can define a new one-way function f new and a predicate f pred such that for all circuits C prime of size S prime, which is only smaller than S by a factor Q, where Q is the query complexity of Hadamard, local list decoding Hadamard, you can say that like for a random input, if you only have access to the evaluation of f nu on this random input, your circuit cannot compute the evaluation of f pred, the predicate on this random input, with advantage of more than epsilon over random guessing. Now, concretely, assume you have a circuit, you have a hard function that cannot be inverted by circuits of poly size with probability 1/poly k. Then Goldreich-Levin assures that you can obtain a hardcore predicate with that cannot be guessed with an advantage of less than 1/polyk. Now, even if the original function you start with has a much stronger hardness, this is all that Goldreich-Levin can give you. And the first question we ask based out of these results is whether it is possible to obtain a much stronger hardcore predicate, maybe by replacing Hadamard with another locally list decodable code. And so we prove that no, it is not possible. And the proof is an extension of the proof for the small epsilon case. Now, we also ask something much more general. So we ask whether maybe it is possible to obtain a hardcore predicate, a stronger hardcore predicate, via some completely different black box kind of method. And we again show that no, so we define a general class of black box methods for obtaining hardcore predicates and show that no, so you cannot really get very strong hardcore predicates by black box methods. And here are a bunch of open problems. So one would be to improve the lower bound for the small epsilon case from 1/√epsilon to 1/epsilon square, the tight lower bound. Now, our lower bound for the large epsilon case can be extended to decode from 1 - epsilon fraction erasures, and not errors, erasures, to get a bound of 1/epsilon. Is it possible to do a similar extension for the small epsilon case? So far, we don't see how our techniques would directly extend, but is it possible? Now, so we only ruled out black box techniques for obtaining stronger hardcore predicates from hard functions, but maybe there are non-black box techniques that can help obtain stronger hardcore predicates from hard functions, and can we do something here? And thank you.
Thank you. All right, is there any quick question while we move to the next talk? Actually, if not, then I have a quick question. So when you say black box, this is black box in what? And can you say very briefly about what kind of more general form of black box reductions you guys prove things about?
Yeah, so in the sense, so we say that a black box reduction can be thought of as a pair, construction and reduction. So construction will map a hard function to a new one-way function and also a predicate. And we do not assume that this map construction is efficiently computable or anything. And the reduction so gets oracle access to my hard function and also some other function h that claims to invert my hard function efficiently, right? And additionally, the reduction can also be non-uniform. So it can also get some advice that depends on both the hard function and also the inverter, in a sense, right? Yeah, so this is the generic setup. I don't think I missed out anything, but yeah, more or less. But of course, there are more details. Yeah.
Good.
Thanks.
All right, thanks. So Silvash, the next speaker, can set up. Excellent. The next talk will be on lower bounds for off-chain protocols, exploring the limits of plasma. This is a work by Stefan Dziembowski, Grzegorz Fabiański, Sebastian Faust, and Silvash Lijie. And Silvash will speak.
Yes. So can you hear me? Yes? No?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Sorry. So, hello everyone. My name is Silvash Lijie, and today I will present the paper Lower Bounds for Off-Chain Protocols, Exploring the Limits of Plasma. This is a joint work with Stefan Dziembowski, Grzegorz Fabiański, Sebastian Faust, and me, Silvash Lijie. Stefan and Grzegorz are from University of Warsaw in Poland, and Sebastian and I are from TU Darmstadt in Germany. So, let's start with some motivation. We as humans need to maintain ledgers or logbooks for many different applications, such as trading, legal agreements, banking, and so on. And traditionally, trusted entities, such as the stock market, notaries, or banks, maintain these logbooks or ledgers for us. However, recent events have shown that these trusted entities are not really trustworthy. For example, there's a scandal regarding a company called Wirecard in Germany's stock market, or we all remember the 2008 housing crisis, which interrupted the global markets quite substantially. And people have been thinking, well, how can we make these trusted entities behave honestly? Well, some say that we can achieve this via more transparency, such that we can detect malicious behavior sooner, but others have been trying to get rid of this trusted entity altogether. And one of the proposals to do so is blockchain technology. And I want to point out that there's a huge realistic and sometimes unrealistic hype around blockchain and technologies related to blockchain. And this work also tries to make the expectations from protocols run over the blockchain to become more realistic. But what is blockchain? Well, blockchain's core is basically a consensus algorithm, which is run between a set of parties, and as long as more than half of the parties participating in this consensus algorithm are honest, they can agree on the latest state of the system. However, consensus algorithms, large-scale consensus algorithms, are expensive. And that's one of the reasons why blockchain technologies do not scale. For example, Bitcoin can process around 10 transactions per second, while Visa payment system can process up to 50,000 transactions per second. This is quite a huge gap here. And people have been thinking and proposing solutions in order to improve blockchain scalability. And one of the more recent proposals, and also the focus of this work, is off-chain protocols. And by off-chain, I mean that parties only communicate with the blockchain if it is necessary, and they try to keep their communication with the blockchain to a minimum. More specifically, we analyze a class of off-chain protocols called plasma protocols. So what is plasma? Well, plasma was first introduced by Poon and Buterin in 2017, and in the literature, it is also referred to as commit chain. The main idea of plasma is as follows. We have an operator, and parties, instead of communicating with a blockchain and submitting their transaction to the blockchain, they submit it to this operator who gathers these transactions, and he periodically timestamps the latest state of the system on the blockchain. More specifically, the operator is basically maintaining his own ledger L. He publishes the content of L off-chain, for example, on his web page, and periodically timestamps this ledger L by publishing the hash of L on the blockchain. By using this hash of L, parties can later refer to it and then prove that, oh, they own some amount of coins in the system. So as you can see here, we are trying to minimize the communication with the blockchain. So it's an off-chain protocol. Let me continue with an example. Assume that Li is the latest state of the system where Alice owns 1 coin, Bob coins 0 coins, and Charlie owns 1 coin. The operator uses a hash function to hash this table and publishes just a hash over the blockchain. This idea can further be improved using Merkle trees, but I will ignore that for the purpose of this talk. So the total balance in the system at this point is 2. Now, Alice can send 1 coin, for example, to Bob, and the state will be updated as follows. Bob will have 1 coin, Alice will have 0 coin, and Charlie will have 1 coin. And this can go on. Now, this idea can also be extended in order to allow deposit and withdrawing assets directly to and from the blockchain to this plasma system using the monetary capabilities of the blockchain. But this solution has a drawback. And the drawback is as follows. The operator can always withhold this state and not publish it to the users. This is called the data unavailability attack. And I will get back to this more in a few seconds. All in all, there are 2 main categories of plasma protocols. One is plasma cash, where users own tokens similar to a cash. So we are assigning tokens to users. And another version of plasma is fungible plasma, where users have accounts similar to checking accounts, and we are assigning balances to users in this system. Now, our contribution is as follows. We show that there is no perfect plasma protocol out there. More specifically, we show that either protocols fall under a situation like plasma cash, where exiting assets from the plasma system to the blockchain requires huge communication with the blockchain, Or we are in a situation like fungible plasma, where the system suffers from a phenomenon called non-uniquely attributable mass exits. And we cannot achieve the best of both worlds. Now, what is non-uniquely attributable mass exits? By non-uniquely attributable, I mean that no judge can decide who is malicious, the accuser or the accused. And this directly relates to the data unavailability attack, because data unavailability has non-uniquely attributable faults. Although I will not really go into the details here in this short talk. And what is mass exit? Mass exit means that honest users must withdraw their assets before it is too late, otherwise they might lose all their coins. And this is quite substantial, because if everyone tries to exit their coins at once, then the blockchain would be overloaded, and again, they have to communicate a lot with the blockchain. So I would refer you to the full presentation and our paper for more details regarding how our proof works, how our modeling works. But here, I would like to give a sneak peek on the main idea behind our proof and our result. So I will continue with our previous example. Alice has transferred one coin to Bob. And now at this point, the operator withholds this latest state, Li plus 1, from Charlie, who is the honest party here. At the same time, Alice reverts her state internally to what it was in Li. So she will claim that she has one coin and she has never made a transfer to Bob. Note that Charlie is completely unaware of what has happened between Alice and Bob in this state. Now, Bob tries to exit from the system. This is completely legal exit. He owns actually one coin in the system. He should be able to withdraw it. After this exit, the total balance of the plasma system would be reduced by 1. So the total balance would be 1 because Bob has exited one coin. So we would end up in the following situation. Alice claims that she has one coin, Charlie has one coin indeed, and Bob is gone. But there is only one coin in the system. So what would happen if Alice exits? Well, Charlie then would not be able to exit his coin because there is not enough balance left in the system. How can we prevent Alice from exiting? Well, either it must be clear from Bob's exit that Alice cannot exit. This means that Bob's exit must contain enough information in it that you can identify people who have actually transferred coins to Bob. So Bob's exit would be large. And the other situation would be that Charlie must exit before Alice. So we would end up in this mass exit situation, which I pointed out before. Now this is just the main idea behind our results. And there are a lot of details that I've just ignored here, but for those, I would refer you to the paper and also the long version of the presentation. So with this, I would like to conclude. In this work, we for the first time initiated the study of lower bounds for off-chain protocols. And we show that there is an inherent separation between plasma cache and fungible plasma. So you cannot achieve the best of both worlds, which were the focus for many years for many of the people working in this area. And both plasma variants have their place and use case in practice. So if you have an operator who is probably semi-trusted, then fungible plasma is the way to go because it would be much cheaper if parties want to exit. But on the other hand, if the operator is not trusted, well, maybe plasma cache would be better. Now, let me point out some future works. Well, we just initiated the study of analyzing lower bounds for off-chain protocols, and there are many different classes of protocols that can be analyzed here: channel networks, virtual channels, and so on. Furthermore, one can try to improve our results or try to analyze them by trying to remove some of the modeling assumptions that we make, or trying to see if the results would go through if the modeling is different. With this, I would like to thank you all for your attention. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask, contact me or any of the co-authors. Thank you very much.
Okay, since this
I had a quick
been a
query.
middle of, oh, go for it. We'll take one question.
Yeah, just the complexity bounds with respect to those new operations that you have introduced. Does that have a effect on the versus the vanilla chains?
Oh, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by the operations that we introduced. You mean the depositing and exiting, or?
Yes, the three, depositing, exiting, and one more operation that you had with respect to the chaining.
So basically, a plasma protocol must have all of these operations: depositing, exiting, and making transfers off-chain. Because otherwise, if you can't deposit and withdraw assets, you're basically timestamping some information on the blockchain. So it is not really that useful. So our lower bound indeed is regarding the communication complexity required with a blockchain in order to allow users to exit their assets from off-chain to on-chain and being able to use it.
Oh, okay, cool, thanks.
No problem.
All right. We'll move now to the final talk in the session, which is about black box uselessness, composing separations in cryptography. This is a joint work between Geoffroy Couteau, Poyef Rashim, and Mohamed Makhmoudi. And Geoffroy will give the presentation.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Everyone can hear me well? Good. So I'm Geoffroy. This is a joint work with Puya and Mohamed. And in this work, we try to take a fresh look at the notion of black box reductions that you've heard about already quite a few times in this session. So let me briefly recall the basics. We're looking at cryptographic reductions. So that's an area of cryptography where we try to prove statements of the form: if primitive A exists, then primitive B exists. And that's very useful because at their core, essentially all or most of our cryptographic primitives rely on unproven assumptions, like assuming P not equal to NP. So proving such reductions simplifies the crypto landscapes and allows us to derive new connections between primitives and to achieve new constructions. So reduction-based cryptography enjoyed many celebrated successes in the past. For example, in the area of private key cryptography, a sequence of celebrated results in the 90s have managed to show that essentially all private key crypto primitives are equivalent. So stream ciphers, universal hash functions, commitment scheme, they can all be reduced to the existence of one-way functions, the most basic object of cryptography. However, there are countless cases where we do not know of such reductions. And that's typically the case when we try to base the existence of public key cryptography, for example, on private key cryptography. So can we construct key agreement out of one-way functions? We don't know. And that's a bit unfortunate and annoying because we believe key agreement exists, we believe one-way function exists, so there has to be a reduction. And the reduction could be, well, ignore the one-way function and build the key agreement from scratch. So this lack of reduction has to be a limitation of our techniques. So the core insight in this area was given by Impagliazzo and Rudisch in 1989, and it's the following. Most cryptographic reductions that we know of are black box in the sense that they are oblivious to the specific implementation of the source primitive and of the adversary. So the slightly more formal definition is that there is a black box reduction from a primitive B to a primitive A if we have a construction and a reduction, and the construction should be such that it's a construction of B which should be efficient whenever we have an efficient implementation of the primitive A, and secure whenever we have a secure implementation of the primitive B, in the sense that we have a reduction from having an adversary against one to having an adversary against the other. So, but let's just stick with black box reduction, or a large set of techniques for reduction that do not precisely look at the at much more than the input-output behavior of the primitives involved. And so the seminar result by Impagliazzo and Rudisch was that there is no black box reductions from key agreement to one-way functions. And since in this seminar result, there has been a tremendous number of black box separation between cryptographic primitives, and they explain why we've been stuck for so long at some problems we're trying to solve, but they also guide future constructions by ruling out a large class of methods. However, there are still some limitations of our black box separation results. And one of them is that a black box separation on, say, between a primitive A and a target primitive P only rules out the possibility of constructing P from A in a black box way, but using A in isolation with nothing else out there. So in particular, it does not say anything about the possibilities that we could build P in a black box way from two primitives A and B, even if A alone or B alone are black box separated from P. So in a sense, we do not have any way to compose our black box impossibility results to derive stronger black box composability results. And that's unfortunate because in crypto, we do that all the time. We take a bunch of cryptographic primitives and assumptions, we sort of mix them together and we obtain new cryptographic primitives. And if we want to prove limitations for black box construction of these types, then currently the only thing we know how to do is say proving black box separation for all subsets of the cryptographic primitives that we might want to consider. So can we do better? Well, in our work, what we do is exactly try to introduce a notion that allows to have this composition, and we call it black box uselessness. Informally, a primitive A is black box useless for building another primitive P if for any auxiliary primitive Z, if we have a black box construction of P from A together with Z, then we must already have a black box construction of P from Z alone. If we have black box uselessness, then we have a natural and easy composition theorem, which says that if A is black box useless for P and B is black box useless for P, then the joint primitive AB has to be black box useless for P as well. Why? Because since A is black box useless for P, if we have a construction from ABZ, we can remove A, seeing BZ as the auxiliary primitive Z prime, and then we can apply the black box uselessness of B to remove B, which proves the black box uselessness of the joint primitive. So that's easy. So in our work, the main contributions are fourfold. First, the definitional framework. We introduce this notion of black box uselessness, identify various flavors, we cast them in the framework of black box reduction, by Ringgold, Trevisan, and Vadan, and we formally prove this composability theorem that I briefly mentioned on the previous slide. And we also show that a large class of black box separation methods that have been used in the past, which is called the compiling out paradigm, satisfies an interesting property in general, which is that this compiling out techniques still works even in the presence of an auxiliary oracle Z. So in a certain sense, it relativizes. And this means that we can directly turn results in this framework into black box uselessness results. So we get kind of for free a large number of black box uselessness results by importing a result from the literature. Then we look at what's probably the most fundamental question we could ask in this area, which is whether one-way functions are black box useless for key agreement, or whether we could use them in a black box way to build key agreement together with other primitives. And we prove the following preliminary results. One-way functions are black box useless in any unbalanced construction of key agreements, which are all construction of key agreements where one of the parties makes only a constant number of queries to the one-way functions. We also prove a number of related results for restricted cases. And finally, we also look at the complementary landscape of black box helpfulness and put forth a conjecture regarding the black box helpfulness of one-way functions for building collision resistant hash functions, but I won't have time to tell more about it. So before I leave you, just a quick glimpse on kind of the main question we look at, which is whether one-way functions are black box useless for building key agreement. So we start from the Impagliazzo-Redish black box separation between one-way function and key agreement. We observe that this attack, so it's an attack against any key agreement that builds on one-way functions in a black box way. This attack fails in the presence of an auxiliary oracle. However, the crucial idea is that we can make the following case distinction. Either one-way functions exist relative to this auxiliary oracle Z. Then that means that we can build our one-way function from Z in the first place, so we don't need the one-way function in our black box construction, and D already implies a key agreement. or there are no one-way functions relative to z. So we have a one-way function inverter, and we managed to use this one-way function inverter to make the Impagliazzo-Redish attack efficient even in the presence of z, up, of course, to some caveats I'll let you see in the papers. And so that's the essence of the proof. There are a bunch of open questions that stem from our work. One of the main one is, can we extend our result to all key agreement protocols? We conjecture that the answer is yes, but we could not prove it. And that concludes my talks. Thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any question.
I have a quick question. Can you tell me which type of key agreement this doesn't work for? Like, what is balanced or unbalanced? I didn't get it.
Yeah, so unbalanced key agreement means one of the parties will only make a constant number of queries to the one-way function in the protocol. So it only makes a very small, like restricted use of the one-way function. Both parties can make an arbitrary number of calls to the auxiliary primitive z. So that's
so in particular, if both parties only call the one-way function constant number of times, your separation works.
Yes.
Your not separation, your result that it's useless works.
Yes, exactly. But the dream result would be that both parties can query the one-way function arbitrarily many times. And in this setting, we only managed to rule out miracle type key agreements, where essentially everything is simultaneous. We send a single message, we start making queries, and we do not make queries when computing the output after receiving the other party message. So this miracle type key agreement, there we can rule out key agreement even with an arbitrary number of queries, but there we impose a restriction on the structure.
Got it. Thank you.
But does that rule out traditional public key cryptography?
So no, it does not rule out traditional public key cryptography. Otherwise, we might have been more cautious with stating our results.
No, I meant.
So different exchange does not make the black box use of a one-way function. It's a direct construction. So it's a direct construction from a specific number theoretic problem. So traditional public key cryptographic.
I'm sorry, I meant if this agreement protocol is based on a public key encryption function. So rule out a reduction that uses a one-way function and another primitive to construct a public key encryption system.
Sorry, yes. We do rule out, so what we rule out construction of key agreements. So these key agreements, they have restrictions. So if you extend that to the setting of public key encryption, what we rule out is the construction of public key encryption that will not make query to the one-way function when invoking the decryption or the decryption function. So we rule out the possibility of having public key encryption that makes any queries in the encryption, but no queries to the one-way functions in the decryption, but possible queries to the other primitive, or where the encryption would only make, one of the encryption or decryption would only make a constant number of queries. This is the kind of thing that we rule out. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Wait, doesn't the second thing, like the first thing was 0 calls to the one-way function and the decryption, and the second thing was constant in one of them. Doesn't that imply, isn't the first case a special case of the second?
I realize that at the same time as saying it. So if I get,
there is also key generation. There is also key generation. So when we say one party asks a constant number of queries, key generation and decryption happen by the same side.
Got it. But if both key generation and encryption is not constant, it's still good, and as long as decryption is 0.
Yes.
Yes.
Got it. Thank you.
Thanks, Mohammed.
Okay, just a moment before other people jump in. So at this time, the next session it will be starting in about a minute. So if you really want to go to those talks, feel free to go ahead to the second Zoom link. However, we are able to stick around, and I'd like to open the floor, I suppose, to questions to any of the authors. So let's go ahead, maybe if it becomes chaotic, and you can use your Zoom hand raising.
So I wanted to ask about the last talk, Posel. So if I don't know if Jeffro maybe can put the slide. So for collision-resistant hashing, do you have an assumption which is maybe unnatural but easy to state, which you think is black box separated from collision resistance, but with one-way function, is sufficient, right?
Okay, for collision-resistant hash function, we don't have we only have a conjecture, but our conjecture is that they are useful for building collision-resistant hash functions, and intuitively, the auxiliary primitive is the Simon oracle. So the idea is the following: Simon oracle. So this very weird kind of one-way permutation, but where you can sample collisions alone. It does not give you a collision-resistant hash function.
Actually, can you explain again, what is this thing?
Yeah, so what we want to show is that one-way functions are helpful for building in a black box way collision-resistant hash function, even though they are black box separated from them. So to do that, we have to exhibit an auxiliary primitive, which is separated from collision-resistant hash function.
Yes, I mean to explain the specific primitive.
So the specific primitive is something that would be essentially Simon's oracle, meaning a one-way permutation, but where you have a collision sampler. So like you have something that allows you to sample collisions. And it's not exactly a primitive, so it's a bit all about formulating exactly what we mean there, but it's a bit technical, but at very high level, this primitive we know does not black box imply collision-resistant hash function. That's Simon's result. However, if you use, say, two instances of this primitive together, like this together with a one-way function, at a high level, it seems to imply a collision-resistant hash function by using the Holmgren-Lombardi result. So the Holmgren-Lombardi result says that if you have two one-way functions simultaneously, and you have some strong kind of amplification results, like inverting both of them happens with probability much smaller than inverting a single one of them, then this implies collision-resistant hash function. So you can reduce the conjectures that one-way functions are black box helpful for collision-resistant hash functions to some conjecture about how one-way functions amplify in the presence of a random oracle, such as Simon's oracle. That's kind of the reduction we have. So the question is, let's give a simple formulation of the question. I give you a one-way function and a random oracle, and the random oracle was sampled independently of the one-way function, and now you need to invert both. Can you prove that inverting both of them simultaneously, your probability of succeeding at doing that is even lower than the probability of inverting, say, just the one-way function? Like even smaller than 1 over exponential. Does that answer your question?
So which implication will it go? Yeah, which implication will it go? So I mean, like the last hardness amplification thing. If you can show it, then you can. Sorry, I just want to make sure that I get the direction.
Yeah, if you can show the last implication, you still don't get much. But if you can show the last implication when replacing the last conjecture, like one-way functions plus some random oracle amplifies, like hardness amplifies. If you can show that even when the random oracle is weakened by a collision finder, then you prove that one-way functions are black box useless for collision-resistant hash functions. But the first step will be to first prove the
You mean helpful? Yeah, Geoffroy, you mean helpful, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the first step will be to prove that one-way functions amplify in the presence of a random oracle without adding a collision finder there. And even this is open, but it looks like a very natural question.
So if you, hi, this is Salil. Just following on the same topic, if you don't kind of insist on focusing on this classic question of one-way functions versus collision-resistant hash functions, do you have any? Are there other? I mean, other examples that you know already, or would conjecture that might be easier to prove about something being black box helpful? I mean, you know, as you said, there are many examples in crypto where we use two different primitives to build some other primitive.
So black box. So the thing. So we have say artificial black box helpfulness, which are uninteresting. For example, the primitive public key encryption plus collision resistant hash function. Well, each of public key encryption and collision resistant hash functions are black box helpful for building it, but in isolation, each of them is black box separated. And you can work out this collision resistance plus public key encryption to get something that looks like meaningful cryptographic primitives, like IBE with some compact keys. So anything that will be some public key encryption, but you also want some kind of shrinking commitment to something. So very low rate public key encryption, some natural primitives like that, you can get essentially the same kind of black box helpfulness, like collision resistant hash function plus public key encryption imply each of them are helpful, but separately they are black box separated. That's
Great.
the kind of thing we
Thanks.
have.
Thanks.
And I'm curious, maybe on the opposite direction, because you mentioned that there are some black box useless. What would be maybe the most natural or surprising, or I don't know, I'm just curious. Well, I guess the conjecture, of course, for one-way functions from key agreement, but in terms of provable results, what is the most surprising black box useless result?
So in a way, the other we have are not surprising because they are built upon the compiling out paradigm. So there are many results in the literature that have been proven, black box separation that have been proven as follow. If you can build some primitive from another one in a black box way, then you can build it in the plain model. For example, that's the case for if you can have an efficient construction of a PRG from a one-way permutation. So that makes only not enough queries to the one-way permutation, then you have a PRG in the plain model. Well, what we show is that these results, they essentially relativize. So you get black box uselessness. So if you can build your PRG using some primitive plus a one-way function, and you do not make so many calls to the one-way permutation, then you don't need the one-way permutation in the first place. But in a sense, it's, say, not completely obvious. There are some technicalities related to showing that and proving exactly what we have. Mohammed could tell more about it because it's really related to many things in his works. So it's expected, but not completely obvious, but still expected in a certain sense.
But this is like efficiency separation, which is very interesting. So basically you're saying you cannot, if you want to have a very efficient construction, then, one-way functions are useless, I guess. But if it's not efficiency, if it's just feasibility, is something where, I don't know, you don't put efficiency restrictions?
Well, feasibility, there are a lot of results of that for I/O. Maybe yes. A couple of weeks ago, I/O would be still kind of, in a different world. But I/O, if you consider it by now a standard primitive, like we know that many things cannot give you I/O with the same proof structure that Geoffroy explained. You basically compile them out from the I/O construction, and that compiling out process also relativizes. So that's a feasibility.
So for example, these all or nothing primitives, they are black box. So like witness encryption and the like, they are black box useless for building, say, approximate indistinguishability obfuscation.
Yeah. The catch is that it's not exactly I/O, it's like approximately correct I/O. Yes.
I see. So
questions for actually just in case there's anybody else who has questions. Otherwise, you can keep going. All right, I guess you've got the floor.
I was just going to clarify, just so maybe, just very quick clarification for me. So interpretation of black box useless result means really, if I want to construct it, I shouldn't even consider this primitive at all. It's kind of something like strictly stronger. I'm just trying to see.
Not really. It might still help you in a non-black box way. Like one-way functions together with I/O give you public key cryptography. That's non-black box, but each of them alone in a black box way, they do not give you. So you should still kind of think about it, but in a non-black box way.
But yeah, so if you think about, you have a bunch of primitives and you would like to get a black box construction of another primitive, then you can exclude from your set all black box useless primitives. They won't help you in any black box construction.
So I had a question for one of the other speakers, for Mikito, if Mikito is still there. Yes. Hi. So just the question was whether there are any implications of your results or versions of them that relate to the complexity of zero knowledge proofs, because I mean that was the context in which these kind of AI primitives were first introduced by Ostrowski and Wigderson.
So yeah, sorry, I have.
So for example, if you want to base the hardness of zero knowledge on NP-hardness, the non-triviality of zero knowledge on NP-hardness, are there?
Yeah, to be honest, I have not considered about the point, zero knowledge proofs. I just only consider the starting point is just NP-hardness. So okay. I think it's a very interesting question. Thank you.
Actually, I also have a question for you. What's your opinion? Are you optimistic or pessimistic in regard to possibility or new direction?
Yeah, I guess the very natural standing point is maybe negative at present, because so the non-adaptive black box reaction for in the case of auxiliary input pseudo-random generator, then we can exclude the collapse of polynomial hierarchy. But then the existence of the auxiliary input pseudo-random generator and auxiliary input Warma function is equivalent. So very natural thought is even in the case of auxiliary input Warma function we can exclude. But in my opinion, the positive. So in the positive perspective, so the goal is very. How to say, very strong, because we can get NP-based one function. But that's why, so I believe the negative perspective, but I think we should not give up such a positive attitude at the first glance. That's why, I consider the important direction is to verify the parity of positivity. Yeah, that's my opinion.
Nice. All right, any additional questions? Evgeny? He left. Okay, in that case, then thanks everyone for.
Maybe just a comment, right? I mean, like regarding all these, whether a one-way function can be constructed using a black box reduction from a worst-case hardness, right? I mean, there are some subtleties. I think a lot of people miss. There are some subtleties here that when you say black box, right, you really mean two things, which are not the same. One is the way the reduction accesses the primitive, right? So it queries and it gets answers back in a black box way. And the second thing is whether when you query the adversary, right, then are you assuming that this adversary is an efficient computation, or is the reduction supposed to work for every choice of adversary? And most of the separations that we have in the literature, right? I mean, when we say black box, we mean both, right? So what we mean is that you cannot do it with a reduction that queries the adversary in a black box way. And also it would work even if the adversary that is breaking the second primitive is inefficient, right? The reason I'm pointing this out is that there are results out there which are somewhat similar to what we want to prove, but weaker, right? The most famous one is probably by Hirahara from 2 years ago, but there's also an old result that we had with Gutfreund and Tashma, which basically show that, right, I mean, that you can somehow get, right, I mean, we do have reductions in the literature, which are black box in the sense that they access the adversary in a black box way, but they are able to exploit the efficiency of the adversary. And for example, if you if you don't make this distinction, these results already break these black box separations. So the kind of results that we are proving using these techniques, right, are ruled out by these black box separations. So we should be we should be very careful when we say, things are impossible to prove in a black box way, but because we don't always mean the same thing, right? Sometimes it can be bypassed by only slightly modifying what we mean.
So we make so in the paper, we really try to make the exact type of black box reductions extremely clear. Like we really say, if we have a black box reduction of this type initially, then we can compile out, say, the one-way functions and get a black box reduction of this type. And actually there is a loss. We get a weaker kind of black box reduction. And we also briefly discussed this notion of class reduction. I think this is what you're talking about. Yeah. So this notion that only works for efficient implementation of. So this, we briefly discussed it actually in the context of black box helpfulness, because, well, I was hiding a few things under the roof, but this notion turns actually to matter when we look at black box helpfulness of one-way functions for cohesion rates and hash functions. But yeah, we try to make the distinction very clear in the paper, and we also acknowledge like these class reductions as something to look at.
Yeah, so very interesting problem, right? Like so far, right, with the exception of Hirahara, which is great, right? We've known these like class reductions for like almost 20 years, like 20 years now, and we haven't been able to do anything useful with them, right? Somehow, right? We have this tool and we don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, we don't even have anything for separating one-way functions from key agreement for class reductions. So even like forgetting about black box uselessness and the likes. So.
Right, any additional questions, comments, suggestions, future predictions? Okay. In that case, thanks to everyone for sticking around, for having the active discussion. I think this has been a lot of fun. And I hope to see you guys around in the rest of the conference.